Okay, so let's take a look at how we can handle errors. And we already have error handling because of our developer exception page, even though we don't see it here, but we're going to create our own. And inside the API, I'm going to create a new folder and call it errors. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file that's going to be a class, and we're going to create a class for API exceptions. And inside this class, we're going to add a constructor, and we're going to use this primary constructor approach. I really quite like this. It's just much cleaner than adding what I consider to be a traditional constructor. So in our constructor, we're going to have the int of the status code. We'll have a string for the message, and we'll have an optional string for the details. And that's optional because our exceptions typically come with a stack trace, but not always, not for every exception. So we have to make this optional, and the details is what we're going to use effectively for the stack trace. And we'll add a prop, that's an int of status code, and we can initialize this using our constructor to the status code. And we'll also have a prop, that's a string, for the message, and we'll initialize this to the message, and we'll also do the same for the details as well, and set this to the details. And of course, we've said this one could be optional, so we need to do the same here as well. We'll specify the question mark there to say that we may or may not have the details for this. So that's the class we'll use and we'll populate when we return an exception to the client. And I want this to be in JSON as well, so that I can return this as a JSON formatted error message that can be used by the client to do what the client needs to do in the user interface to notify the user of the problem that's occurred. So we're going to create some middleware to do that and to generate that response. And in the API folder, I'm going to create another new folder and call it middleware. And inside the middleware, I'm going to add a new file and call it exception middleware. And once again, I've forgotten to specify class. So I'm just going to Control X, select class, Control V, and press return. And let's create what we need here. So our exception middleware, and let's take a very brief look at the .NET Core middleware documentation here. And really, I just want to refer to this diagram, create a middleware pipeline with web application. So the ASP.NET Core request pipeline consists of a sequence of request delegates called one after the other. And the following diagram demonstrates the concept. So our HTTP request comes in. And then we get to the first piece of middleware. Any logic is applied, and then we call next. And off we go to the next piece of middleware, execute any logic inside it, and then execute next. And so on and so forth, and we can do more logic on the way out as well. Now, if there's an error with any of this logic that causes an exception, then that exception can either be handled locally inside the middleware, or if it's not handled anywhere, then it gets passed back up the chain until it finds something that can catch and handle the error. And our middleware is going to live right at the top of this chain. So if any of the logic in our application causes an exception, it's always got somewhere to fall back to and be caught by, rather than being unhandled. So that's the goal of what we're doing here. And we need to provide some parameters or inject stuff into our exception middleware. And we need to get hold of the request delegates that we just mentioned, and we'll call it next. We're also going to add logging in here. So I'm going to add iLogger, and the type parameter for the iLogger is the class that we're using. So this is going to be exception middleware, and we'll call it logger. And we'll also get hold of the iHost environment and call it env, and we'll use that to see whether or not we're running in production or development mode. And inside here we need to provide this with a method, and it's going to be called public async task. And this is not my own invention of a method name. When we're using middleware, we have to call the invoke async because that is what is being expected when we call the next method. That's going to look for an invoke async method. So it has to be called invoke async here. Please don't experiment. Or if you do experiment, please feel free to experiment, I should say. But then when it doesn't work, just come back and give it the correct name. And then I'm going to say context as the name of the HTTP context, which we also have access to. Because this is middleware, we're working with an HTTP request, we have access to the HTTP context. So inside here, we are going to use a try-catch block because we do need to handle the error when it happens. But in the try block, we're going to say await next and pass in the context. We're simply going to move on to the next request delegate. We're only handling errors inside here, and we're not doing anything with the HTTP request itself unless there is an error on its journey through our API. So we'll call the exception EX, and let's add the logic for our middleware. So if we do get an error, I'm just going to say logger and log error, and we'll pass in the exception and ex.message. And this will log out to our terminal. And we want to use our context here to do something with the response. So I'm going to say context and response. This is our HTTP response. And we're going to give it a content type equal to application/JSON. And we're also going to give our context response a status code equal to, and we'll pass this into an int and say HTTP status code and internal server error. And then we'll work on our response, and we'll say var response equals, and we're going to check to see if we're in development mode. So we'll use env is development, and then we'll use a ternary. And if we are in development, we're going to say new API exception, and we're going to say context response.status code as the first parameter. We'll say ex.message as the second parameter, and ex.stacktrace for the details of the request. And then the other side of the ternary is pretty much the same thing, except for the stack trace. We're not going to return that to the user, and instead of the stack trace, we're just going to say internal server error and close that statement with a semicolon. Now, because we're going to return this as a JSON response, we want this to be in camel case. So we're going to create some options for the JSON serializer. So we're going to say var options equals JSON serializer options, and we're going to give it a property naming policy equal to JSON naming policy and camel case. And then we'll say var JSON equals JSON serializer and serialize, and we'll serialize our response and pass it the options. And then we can say await context.response and write a sync and pass in JSON. So the idea is we're going to return effectively one type of response for when we're in development and a less detailed response when we're in production, similar to what we've got now. But the way that we're going to return this one as a JSON response means that we can work with that inside our client, our Angular client, more easily. Now, in order to use this middleware, we need to add it to our middleware in the program.cs. And error handling middleware or exception handling middleware has to go at the top of the pipeline. So we're going to say app use middleware, and then we're going to specify exception middleware. And that is it. So let's just restart our app. And obviously hot reload is going to tell us that, nope, it didn't like that either. And we'll wait for this to restart. And let's go back to Postman. And we should get a different kind of response now when we execute our server error request. And what we get now is a JSON response. So we've got this status code of 500, the message, and then the stack trace. And our stack trace is output with these new lines, so it's going to be formatted a bit more easily when we use this in HTML. So that's our server side taken care of, and next we're going to take a look at the client side.